Hello, Daily Bible Readers. This is our day 53 preview of our reading of the New Testament and of Genesis. Today's readings will come from Luke chapter 16 as well as Genesis chapter 39. And so let's turn our Bibles to Luke chapter 16. Luke chapter 16 involves several parables that Jesus speaks to, particularly directed toward the Pharisees, it seems. He tells a parable about an unjust steward who was called into question about the way he cared for his master's belongings, his money and his books. And understanding that he was going to be found out, he was unjust in what he was doing, that he would then lose his position. And he says, that's all I know how to do. I don't know how to dig ditches, and I'm too proud to beg. So he comes up with this plan. He calls the debtors in that owed his master's money and asked them what they owed. And whatever they owed, he basically cut it in half and said, okay, you just write down, this is what you owe him. And I'll write down the same in the books. And then that's all you'll owe him. And it says that the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. And that seemed kind of odd for us to see Jesus showing a man that's being unjust in his life. And then when he's found out to be unjust, he goes about to a deeper deception, even just to try to make way for provisions when he's cast out of his master's house. But notice how that particular verse ends. It says, "For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light." Now, we understand how individuals who are caught up in evil acts, like not being just in their stewardship, will, when found, go to deeper debts just to make sure that they have secured some sort of a place in life when they're cast out. That's what the steward was doing. He said, I'm going to be cast out for my master. If I do this for his debtors, then maybe they'll take me in and they'll take care of me. And he makes this plan and he works the plan. And that's what he's really being commended for, is knowing that there is a judgment coming and making provisions to make sure he has something after the judgment, a place to be, a life to have. And yet the sons of light, is that the way he puts it there? The sons of light in this generation, they should know that they're going to be judged, but they're not making provisions for what comes afterwards. There's no sense of urgency. There's no sense of desire to want to make sure I've done all that I can do to make sure I had the place where I need to have it. And so he talks then about them being just or righteous, faithful in what they have been blessed with, and how they've handled that on whether or not they'll be given the ultimate benefit of responsibility in the kingdom. And from the standpoint of the Jewish nation and the Pharisees particular, they were being unjust with the stewardship that they had been given for the law of God and for being God's people. But yet, when they see the judgment coming, notice who they make, friends with. They go find people that are going to lie against Jesus. They pay a man to betray Jesus. They go to all kind of depths to try to avoid making things right. They just go deeper into the wrong, into the unrighteousness. And Jesus said in doing so, they're going to miss out on the kingdom. And so the Pharisees hear this according to verse 14, and we get a little insight into some of their motivation. I believe it has a lot to do with power, but Luke here says it also has a lot to do with money, that they're lovers of money, that they receive from the people, and if they were to accept Christ, that they would lose that position and that power. And so he says, that God knows what it is in their hearts. And if they really were following the law and the prophets, and that's where he goes, the law and the prophets were until John. Okay, the law and the prophets all foretold of the coming of the Christ, and John was supposed to be the last of those prophets. He was supposed to be the one that made straight the way for the Lord's coming. So all the prophets and all of the law was looking until the time of John. And then when John came, we might say the rush was on. He puts it, everyone is pressing into it. Hey, remember John and Jesus both came preaching, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It's time. We need to rush. This isn't something we need to wait on. You can't do it later. It needs to happen now. And that all of that wasn't changing. It was so unchanging that Jesus says that heaven and earth should be easier for it to pass away than for one tittle of the law to fail. The law and the prophets told of the coming of the Christ and the necessity to follow him. He was the Lord upon whose name they would need to call. He would be the Christ, the Messiah. But yet when he's come now, they want to find some other law. They want to find some other means. They want to find some other some other way to attach themselves and still receive the benefit. And that may be why we have this verse 18 recorded at this particular time. It seems a little odd, almost out of place, for Jesus to talk about divorce and remarriage, that whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced from her husband commits adultery. So it's almost a double illustration here. It seems that the Pharisees were very concerned, the Jewish leaders were very concerned about how could they put their wives away and marry another. You'll recall that in Matthew chapter 19, they're the ones who come and question Jesus about who could divorce their wife and remarry. And Jesus takes them all the way back to the beginning and says, that's not the way God designed any of it to happen. But here, so it's possible that these Pharisees that are hearing are literally divorcing their wives and marrying another, or putting their wife away. And when that wife marries another, she's committing adultery, and the husband that she's married is committing adultery. It goes the other way if the wife should put away the husband. Then, but it's also sort of symbolic of a spiritual adultery here, that the Jews who were should be married to God because they're not willing to accept Jesus as the Christ, are divorcing from the law and from Moses, and they're taking up their own husbands, their own connection. And so they're committing quite probably literal adultery as well as spiritual adultery. And so then Jesus goes on to tell a most familiar parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Sometimes it's referred to as a parable. It seems to be something more than a parable. Even if a parable, it's a parable that speaks the truth, or it could be a literal event that has occurred. But I want you to focus on the last few verses of it. It's terrible that to see this afterlife that you cannot escape the torment from. But I want you to be concerned with what the Lazarus, or what the rich man wants Lazarus to do, to come back from the dead and tell his brothers, you don't want to be here. You need to follow, the what the law and the prophets have pointed toward. So still kind of an allusion back to the Pharisees and their divorcing from the laws because they're not comfortable and don't like the Christ. But Moses or Abraham tells him, they have the law and they have Moses, and if they won't listen to them, they won't listen though one return from the dead. And I think it's always interesting to think that Jesus will soon rise from the dead, and even then men will reject him and his message. And so these are my thoughts from Luke chapter 16. Let's turn our attention now to Genesis chapter 39. Now, if we close Genesis chapter 37, Joseph had been sold into slavery. We had a little sidebar in chapter 38. Here in chapter 39, he's now come down into Egypt, and here in Egypt, he's in the house of Potiphar. That's the way chapter 37 had ended. A few verses and I mentioned these in chapter 37 that I always like to, or that always draw my attention. And that was particularly verse 3, that says, and his master saw that the Lord was with him. I think it's interesting that something that Potiphar is actually able to see or to witness. And I don't believe it's some kind of, aura or glowing light around Joseph particular, but I believe it's the way that Joseph lives. And because of the way he lives, even in slavery, he is prosperous for the Lord, and the Lord helps him to prosper. That the Lord is with Joseph because Joseph takes the Lord with him. And where I see this especially is when Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. And he talks about how he's been blessed in Potiphar's house, and Potiphar has done this for him and that for him and given him into his hand everything in his house and everything that is except for his wife. But yet when Joseph is making his case to Potiphar's wife, he says, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? He may have been thinking, how can I do this and sin against my master, Potiphar? How can I do this because my master, Potiphar, has been so good to me? But rather, in this case, Joseph says, how can I do this and sin against my God, against God, who, in this case, we might say, has been so good to me? You think, good to me? He had you cast into a pit, and by your brothers pull you out of the pit and they sell you to a band of merchants that are passing through. So you're sold into slavery, and then you're taken down into a foreign land, and you're sold to someone there in that land, and you're living now as a slave and as a servant in a house when you should be living with your father back in Israel. And you're saying, how can I be so good? God's been so good to me. How can I sin against him? But that's the way Joseph lives. He lives in the circumstances in which he is, in service and of dedication to God. And even in this case, once he's taken by Potiphar and thrown into the prison, we find that the guard there in the prison says that the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did, there it was his doing. That the guard now of the prison sees that so much that because the Lord was with him, verse 23, the keeper of the prison didn't worry about anything. Now, in your day-to-day life, are there people in authority who give you responsibility because they see the Lord is with you, because you bring the Lord with you, so much to the point that they don't worry about whatever they put you in whatever responsibility they've given you? They don't worry about it. They don't feel they even need to come and check and make sure you're doing it, because they know you are living so much for the Lord. You have the Lord so much with you, and the Lord is with you, and it's prospering what you do because you're working as if you're doing it for the Lord. Is that the way you live? Do you live the way Joseph lived? Or do you let your circumstances, man, I got to be, why am I the low guy on the totem pole here? Why do I have to do the dirty work? Why do I have to do the stuff that's nasty? Or do you do it as if you're doing it for the Lord, and as such it prospers, and others can see that, and because of it, they're happy to let you be responsible for all their goods because they know they can trust you because you have the Lord with you, and the Lord is with you. These are my thoughts on Genesis chapter 39 as well as Luke chapter 16. Hope they've been helpful to you. And as always, our prayer is that you allow the Word of God to be a lamp unto your feet and a light unto your path.